It is a particular pleasure to visit a scholar from my own alma mater, the University of Cambridge, Zarakol, who belongs to Emmanuel College. Some of you may know that Emmanuel College was the home of John Harvard, who then went to the United States and founded his little sort of spin-off university. Isa is an enormously accomplished scholar. She is one of those people who are dealing with the rise and fall of great powers. She has published a book called After Defeat, which is about the integration of vanquished great powers after war. It talks about the role of Turkey after World War I, about the role of Japan after World War II, and the role of Russia after the Cold War. A book that I would encourage you all to have a look at if you have a chance. But today, Aisha has been charged with a very difficult topic, and one that I believe is close to all our hearts, or at least one that interests all of us. And that is how the Muslim world learned to live with the West, the lessons from the past. Professor Zarakol, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It is a great honor and privilege to be here talking to you this afternoon. And as Asla mentioned, my talk is entitled How the Muslim World Learned to Live with the West. And it occurred to me that when you saw this title, you may have asked yourself, given all that is going on in the world these days, has it? Has it really? So I should explain that the title, as Asla mentioned, is a reference to my book, which is about East-West relations in general. And as also mentioned, it deals with three Eastern powers' relationship with the West, with a focus on the period right after their respective defeats, Turkey after World War I and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, Japan after World War II and the loss of the Japanese Empire, and Russia after the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union. Since the publication of the book, I have published other work applying some of the arguments from the book to other contexts such as Thailand and the Western Balkans. And in the last couple of years, I've had many people come up to me after talks like this, people familiar with places such as India, China, Brazil, or even Central Asian republics, and say that the dynamics I've identified are very familiar to them. I mention this to underline the fact that my work in general is not about the Muslim world specifically, but rather about the particular dynamics of the relationship between the West and what may be called, for lack of a better term, the rest. So initially, when it came up that I was tasked with speaking about the Muslim world, I thought of objecting, but then I thought I might as well accept the challenge. So what I want to do today is to first make a brief pitch about studying hierarchies in international relations, which what my recent work has focused on. Then discuss some insights from my work about how social hierarchies in general function in the international system. And then focus by drawing from some more recent work on the specific challenges that face what is called the Muslim world. I will in fact argue that the challenges that face the Islamic world or the Middle East are not unique to those communities, even if they seem uniquely intractable. The difference that separates that part of the world from the rest is one of degree and not one of kind. But before we get to that, a quick pitch about the importance of studying hierarchies in the international order. If you've had any exposure to international relations as an academic discipline, then you're probably aware that for the last few decades the discipline has been organized around the anarchy problematique. Most closely associated with Kenneth Waltz, this is the idea that international politics fundamentally differs from domestic politics, because international politics is decentralized and anarchic, in the sense that there is no world government or sovereign, and domestic politics is centralized and hierarchic. Ken Vogt set these parameters in 1979, and it's actually possible to trace how influential they became in the subsequent decades in our understanding of the world out there. According to a literature survey conducted by Jack Donnelly, before 1979, very few books in IR even referred to the concept of anarchy more than once, whereas afterwards, the majority referred to it 10 times or more. Vogt was what is called a neorealist, but the anarchy assumption was also conceded by most other main schools of thought in international relations, within neoliberalism and even some variants of constructivism. Whatever you make of anarchy as a starting point for studying international politics, I hope to convince you today that it should not be an ending point. For the last few years, I've been overseeing a collaboration of leading IR scholars from around the globe who differ from each other in many ways. They ran the gamut from positivists to critical and post-colonial theorists. What they all agree on, however, is that the fact that the excessive orientation towards the concept of anarchy in the academic discipline of IR has made it difficult to study various world political dynamics that are hierarchical. These scholars want to bring hierarchies, whether we're talking about political and formal hierarchies such as empires or quasi-empires or spheres of influence, or economic hierarchies or social hierarchies, back into the realm of things we should study seriously in international relations, both as causes of war and possibly as solutions of peace. I'm happy to talk more about this disciplinary move we're making in the Q&A, but let me now turn to my own work on social hierarchies in hopes of demonstrating to you what we may learn from taking hierarchies seriously in world politics. So let me start with the book that's been mentioned. After Defeat, How the East Learned to Live with the West was about East-West relations as a social hierarchy. My goal was to explain how countries that may be called Eastern powers, Turkey, Japan, and Russia, joined and adapted to a modern international order whose rules were not of their own making, and the continued repercussions of this origin story. The famous British historian Arnold Toynbee recognized how pivotal this transformation was almost a century ago. In the conclusion to his 1927 volume on Turkey, he says, and indulge me for a moment while I quote at length, "During the last few centuries, our Western society has been intruding upon the other civilizations of the world with greater insistence. First, it has drawn them all into the meshes of its economic system. Next, it has enlarged the borders of its political ascendancy almost as far as the borders of its trade. And latterly, it has been invading the life of its neighbors on the most intimate plane, the plane of social institutions and of spiritual emotions and ideas. This revolutionary process of westernization, which at this moment is overtaking the Turks and many of their co-religionists in other Islamic countries, has already proceeded further among the Oriental Christian ex-subjects of the Turks in southern Eastern Europe and among their Oriental Christian ex-enemies in Russia. And it is actively at work among the Hindus and the Far Easterners. Thus, in studying the westernization process in Turkey, we're increasing our understanding of the human world in which we ourselves live and move and have our being for the issues with which the Turks have been confronted by their contact with the West are confronting other non-Western peoples the world over. Everywhere these peoples stand at the parting of the ways with the choice of entering the camp of the Zealots or the camp of the Herodians. They can no longer remain neutral, for the West, in its restless activity, will not let them alone. Shall they accept the civilization of the West and attempt to adjust their own lives to it, or shall they reject it and attempt to cast it out as a devil which is seeking to possess their souls? Arnold Toynbee, writing these lines in 1927, was exactly right. Since the long 19th century, the most fundamental existentialist question for countries outside of the core of the Western civilization has been defined as this: do we embrace the West or do we reject it? This particular social hierarchy is almost baked into the DNA of the modern international order, as well as the question of what is the better survival strategy. Who's right, the Herodians or the Zealots? Let's begin with the latter. Zealotry certainly has its appeals. But since the formation of the modern international order, rejecting Western standards, or not being able to fully embrace them for whatever reason, has entailed high costs. In the late 19th century, for instance, it would have meant, at the very least, a lesser legal status and withholding of sovereign rights. As you may know, the 19th century European standard of civilization divided the world into spheres of civilization, semi-civilization, and barbarity, with corresponding degrees of sovereign recognition or lack thereof. In the early 20th century, not living up to European standards of civilization could still mean being relegated to mandate status under the League of Nations framework. After World War II, the standards shifted from being ostensibly about civilization to a focus on modernization and development, and the particular methods a country used to achieve those ends, capitalism versus communism. Recent decades have emphasized regime type, especially democracy and respect of human rights. Even today, countries that do not accept certain standards, for the most part still have their origins in Western norms, and behave accordingly, face the possibility of intervention with humanitarian justifications. At best, they're left isolated. Note that I'm not at the moment making a judgment about whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. I want to leave that issue aside for the moment. The only thing I'm asking you to consider thus far is the fact that since the long 19th century, for a non-Western country, not having embraced Western standards domestically has been costly. This has been used as a justification for colonization, for interference in domestic affairs, for violation of treaties, for withholding investments and other economic favors. I realize that one could reasonably argue that the costs have been decreasing and the standards are increasingly moving away from more particularistic signifiers of Westernness, such as religion or dress or race, to more universalistic criteria reflecting something like merit. But the point about the high exogenous costs of norm violation nevertheless stands. These hierarchies do exist. Furthermore, Western or international reaction to norm violation is only part of the story. There are likely endogenous costs as well. First, there is the very real possibility that rejection of Western standards or values or practices or norms may mean rejecting things that are good or useful in and of themselves. This would be another way zealotry could be a costly decision. Think of it as something like this. If I stop listening to my favorite band because they have now sold out, and now everybody likes them, this is a decision that has cost for me. I no longer get to hear songs I like, not because they're no longer good, but because I don't like their association with a certain group of people. In addition to this concrete loss, this attitude is probably not good for my psyche. In rejecting my favorite band because they sold out, I may be rejecting something in order to preserve a sense of myself as an I that is distinct from others. But what I'm really doing is defining myself in opposition to something. I'm not liking or disliking things not because of their intrinsic value or utility, but because of my desire to set myself apart from some people. This will have a psychological toll. I also now have to worry about maintaining this boundary I have constructed. That is another cost. In sum, the zealot route, the rejection of Western norms, has all types of costs for countries. Since that is indeed the case, we must wonder, as Dostoevsky did in 1863, speaking of his fellow countrymen, is it possible that any of us could have prevailed against this influence, this appeal, this pressure? How is it that we have not been regenerated once and for all into Europeans? That we have not been so regenerated, I think we all will agree, some with joy, others with, of course, with anger, that we have not grown up enough for regeneration. But that is another matter. I'm speaking only of the fact that we have not been regenerated, even in the presence of such irresistible influences. And I cannot understand this fact. What Dostoevsky was asking about Russia in the 19th century is still a question worth asking, applicable in many different contexts. How is it that non-Westerners have not been regenerated as Westerners yet? Why haven't we all become Herodians? There is a dismissive answer to this question, which is to say we indeed have, in all the ways that actually matter. The Turkish Nobel laureate for literature, Orhan Pamuk, observed in an interview that when he travels to Asia, he's struck by the fact that no one in Japan, China, or Hong Kong sees his country as completely Eastern. He notes that people in China can relate to his books, most of which deal with Turkey's in-between status vis-à-vis Europe and the Middle East. He notes, they say, yes, Mr. Pamuk, we have the same East-West question here. They think that they're also torn between the East and the West, the way we are here in Turkey. They don't consider themselves in China or in Tokyo completely East. They think that they have some part of the West and East, you see, and they will tell you this and they will smile, knowing the strangeness of it. There's no place, perhaps in humanity, where the subject considers himself completely Eastern. People think this, I would like to believe, because a part of them instinctively knows that wherever they are and whatever system they have, it is a hybrid. There is at least a little bit of the DNA of Western modernity in all of us. The Westphalian Nation-State is a good example. We all have experience with such a state, or at the very least, one that aspires or pretends to be such a state. Or even in the extreme case of Daesh, one that defines itself in complete opposition to such a state. The template is nevertheless present in all of these circumstances. These days, the focus is so much on how different we are from each other. But if you think instead of how much similarity there exists between nation-states and put this in historical perspective, it should actually take your breath away. For instance, I can fly to any place in the world tomorrow, and when I land, reasonably expect to find similar-looking airport buildings, to encounter passport officers dressed more or less the same, who will use similar computers to look up my data and stamp my passport quite the same way. I will step outside and I will be able to hail a taxi cab or some other vehicle that serves the same purpose, and the taxi will be driving on a road that looks, in essence, like all the roads I've been on. Anywhere I go, I will be able to observe police officers and soldiers who are dressed in uniforms. They will also look more or less the same. The point is, I could go to the most anti-Western country in the world, say North Korea, and despite some differences, the way the country is organized will be recognizable to me. Compare that to a traveler 1,000 years ago. When people traveled in medieval Europe, they had no idea what to expect if they detoured out of well-known pilgrimage routes. The unknown world was considered a torrid zone. Their conception of the people in the so-called antipodes was not dissimilar from our present-day conceptions of extraterrestrial aliens. And they were not so far off in this perception, in that the world before the emergence of a modern global order was a much more variable place, culturally, linguistically, even ontologically. We forget this. It is easy to forget what a homogenizing force modernity has been when we look at the world and see it carved into nation-states, all emphasizing their particularity as a justification for their right to exist. But in a sense, nation-states are like individuals in modern society. Their desire to be distinct is what makes them so similar. This brings me to the less dismissive answer about the question of why non-Westerners have not all regenerated as Europeans by now. Because we and they all want to be distinct. Of course, the desire to be distinct from each other is too a product of particular historical forces that gave rise to our modern order. Distinct cultures, distinct shared memories, distinct histories, etc. This is what is supposed to constitute the nation. And it is the presence of a nation or a distinct culture that gets one recognition, gets a group of people's sovereignty in the modern order. In order to make the case that they too were worthy of sovereignty and independence, non-Western peoples had to make the case that they too were members of nations with a right to self-determination. In other words, preserving and reifying certain elements of non-Western culture was itself a decision made in the context of Western modernity. Many local cultural elements and motifs came to be valued precisely because they were distinct from European cultures, precisely because they were not Western, and therefore allowed for a case to be made that their practitioners constituted distinct cultures worthy of respect in an age of colonialism and nationalism. Now let me back up here for a moment and explain. As I noted previously, the logic and pressures of the emergent European system offered non-Western peoples hardly any choice in its process of expansion. Non-emulation was costly, as I've discussed. It meant interference at the very least and economic backwardness. So those who had the choice, i.e. those who avoided colonization, chose to emulate. They did this quite willingly, first in order to compete. A good example of this pattern is Russia, starting with Peter the Great, and then Ottoman Empire after the Tanzimat period, and Japan during the Meiji era. Among the elites, there was much internalization of the values of Western modernity. So it was not just a matter of strategic borrowing, nor simply an external imposition. Yet, as these cases demonstrate, while rejection is costly, emulation is not a cost-free activity either. It has consequences. First, you have to deal with the fact that you're not the original, which raises questions about authenticity, which I will come back to. It also means that you're not the rule maker. By copying someone, especially if you're attempting to copy them wholesale, you're essentially conceding that the rules of the game are as they should be, and you're conceding the legitimacy of the existing hierarchy. You're conceding their standards even as you're trying to better yourself according to their standards. Piecemeal borrowing may not pose these problems, especially in contexts of objective valuation. Let's say, for example, I'm walking to work and I see you on your bicycle. I realize this is a superior method of transportation compared to walking, and the next day I go and acquire a bicycle. Now I can race you to work. In the rational world of physics, it does not matter which of us had the idea first to get on a bicycle. Whoever can ride faster will win the race. But if you imagine a different, less rational, more subjective world of valuation, however, when we're not competing about getting from point A to B, but instead we're competing for recognition, this logic does not apply. Let's say instead that you guys all belong to a cool bicycle club in Oslo. You hang out together and you have each other's back. When you fight amongst yourselves, you do it more like a fair fight between equals with certain rules of engagement that evolved over time. There are certain rules of conduct that you generally respect when it comes to members of the club, even if you don't particularly like them. But you see everybody else outside of your bicycle club as not worthy of the same respect. You don't see a problem cutting pedestrians off. If they were civilized and worthy of respect, they would not be walking in the first place. You also don't see a moral problem taking from them things like bicycle lights and metal chains. They would not know what to do with these things in the first place. In fact, perhaps they're so clueless about transportation that you'd both be better off if you arranged how they moved around. Maybe they should not have the right to decide. Let's say I'm one of these pedestrians. I assess the situation and realize that soon I will not be able to decide for myself how I get from point A to B. You're both faster than me and more organized as a group, whereas I do not know other pedestrians, even though there are many more of us. Plus, you have bicycles, which I've come to realize in my heart of hearts are just a better way of transportation than walking. And I'm kind of feeling like an idiot for not having thought of getting a bicycle in the first place. Therefore, I find your treatment of pedestrians justified to some extent. For these reasons, I don't really want to associate with my fellow pedestrians, and I seek your approval instead. The best solution for me seems to be that I join your club. If you think of me as one of you, then I will get certain privileges that non-members do not have access to. I will be on the side of the smart guys. My friend managed this last year, and even though you guys still think of him as kind of a loser because he was so desperate to join your club, he is now in your club, so you leave him alone. The problem then becomes, how do I go about achieving this? You may find this analogy a little on the nose, but I think it does capture some aspects of the social dynamics of the post-19th century international order. It was not enough for countries like the Ottoman Empire or Japan to simply emulate the West in matters of military technology. It was not a matter of getting on a bike. The standards of the period were such that these countries had to signal in a multitude of ways that they were civilized enough to be worthy of respect and equal treatment. This is why in the Meiji era, you suddenly have Japanese consumption of beef in large quantities in violation of Shinto principles. What does eating beef have to do with civilization? For a whole multitude of reasons I don't have time to get into now, but I explore in my body of work, Western advantage came to be seen as a packaged civilizational deal and was as a result emulated as a package. This is quite different from most examples of competitive borrowing of military technology throughout history. In the modern encounter of the non-West with the West, copying extended to all sorts of lifestyle issues that had nothing to do with industrialization or military technology. It extended to forms of dress, forms of music, forms of writing, gender relations, basically every sphere of life. So, to recap once again, elites in non-Western polities started emulating the West because they wanted Western powers to treat their countries as equals and not their inferiors. They were different from the Western core, so they were stigmatized. They wanted to overcome their stigmatization by correcting all aspects of life that were outside of the Western norms. But this is where it gets really tricky. You see, there is an unavoidable existential dilemma here. This strategy of trying to acquire respect by emulating someone wholesale is also likely to erode your self-respect to a considerable extent. It is one thing for norms and practices to converge accidentally. This happened all the time before modernity. It is another thing for emulation to be undertaken deliberately and at the time of record-keeping and national history writing. How does one retain a sense of dignity under such conditions? By emphasizing and at times getting irrationally attached to the few things that remain that are different. Let me give you another example. At the peak of the Meiji period, and after Japan had accomplished much in the way of Bunmei Kanka, civilization and enlightenment, Japan participated in the Paris exhibition of 1878. They did not go to this exhibit, however, with their new modern products. They did not want to show these new products because they worried that these products would look like pale imitations of their Western counterparts. So instead, they showed in the Paris exhibit traditional craftwork, because this was what they did better and what they did differently from Europeans. The reason this is complicated in ways we don't normally think about is that it is precisely at this moment that Japanese traditional craftwork came to be imbued with a sense of significance it did not have traditionally. I do not mean to imply that traditional crafts were not valued before, but they were valued differently, perhaps in and of themselves, and not as evidence of a national or cultural essence. Traditional craftwork became the essence of Japanese culture when it became exhibited as such, as the evidence that the Japanese were not simply emulators, but a distinct and ancient culture worthy of respect. And it was not just relatively innocuous things, such as crafts, that were invested with this newfound significance. In 1878, Japanese scholar Kurokawa wrote, compared to various foreign countries, it must be said that Japan is not their equal in literature, nor in military strength, nor in architecture, nor in transport, nor in traditional crafts, nor in commerce. He argued that the only thing that made the Japanese superior to European nations was their loyalty to the emperor. In other words, the emperor also acquired a new significance at this time for Japan, precisely because European states by that point were not very loyal to their kings. Things that made Japan distinct acquired new significance. What I'm describing is not specific to Japan. I have been using the Japanese case as an example as opposed to the Muslim world because it is the closest thing to a success story for those who have followed this path, which makes it easier to discuss without people getting defensive. I could tell you many similar stories around the world, from around the world. Post-colonial scholars, for example, have also noticed that under colonialism, local religious habits gained newfound significance apart from their spiritual meanings as markers of distinct local identities, nations, and cultures. Even today, in many places, authenticity gets defined negatively around traits that are not associated with the West. And somewhat ironically, what is authentic keeps changing as the West itself changes. It is not an accident, for example, that Putin started flaming fans of homophobia and started advancing an anti-gay rights rhetoric precisely around the same time that many Western states were moving towards recognizing gay rights and same-sex marriages. Russian society has become more homophobic over time, not less. But this development cannot be understood separate from these dynamics that I've been discussing. For all these reasons, it is worth remembering that the non-West, including the Muslim world, is as much a product of modernity as the West is. The stories we tell ourselves about what is authentic are misleading. In a way, nothing is. There are people in places like Afghanistan or Syria today who delude themselves into thinking that they have protected themselves from the influence of the West by rescuing the pure version of Islam from the mists of history, without realizing that the obsession with purity and history are all part of the modern mindset. It is only with the modern realization that identity is constructed and eminently constructible comes the accompanying worry about authenticity, as well as the concerns over standards and boundaries that we use to tell the genuine ones apart from the fakes. In a world where there is no self-fashioning, no one worries about authenticity. So let me turn, in the last part of my talk, to the title that we were promised, to the Middle East and the Muslim world, where these social hierarchies I have identified have played out in particularly problematic ways. Let me start with my own country of origin, Turkey. After World War I and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, Turkey's responses to its stigmatization problem was to overhaul its domestic system entirely in order to gain acceptance from Europe as a modern Western state. This decision had some precursors in the Ottoman system of the 19th century, but it was in the early 20th century that Turkey fully committed to this strategy. And this was the trajectory Turkey was on for most of the 20th century. The goal of Westernization was built into the national identity of Turkey via the ideology of Kemalism, after Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, the founder of modern Turkey. You could call this an all-in strategy of Herodianism. Yet this did not achieve what it was designed to achieve. Turkey was not accepted fully, nor particularly respected. At the same time, speaking of domestic costs, many of Turkey's present-day problems are a consequence of the extreme lengths this choice has led to. The Turkish state was greatly empowered to do pretty much anything, as long as it was in the service of closing the gap between Turkey and the West. Many of the horrible things that the Turkish state has done in the 20th century, from its authoritarian tendencies to its often atrocious treatment of ethnic and religious minorities, to suppression of everyday religious practice, was justified thusly with reference to international hierarchies. Now, the pendulum has swung in the opposite direction. Turkey has a government and a ruler who seem to reject the legacy of Kemalism and Westernization and promise to restore Turkey to the glory of its Ottoman past. This strategy is even more problematic than the previous one. Erdogan's eastward Islamist turn does not signal a return of Turkey to its essence. It just adds another wrinkle to Turkey's very complicated relationship with the West. The AKP government is not the second coming of the Ottomans, whatever they may say. In their obsession with the West, in their understanding of the Turkish state, in their desire for social engineering, they're much more similar to the Kemalists than their supposed Ottoman predecessors. What is true of Erdogan and Turkey's Islamists is true in general of all Islamists of the Middle East, who think restoration of lost glory is just a matter of rejecting the choices made by the 19th and 20th century modernizing governments in the region. Yet they know little of the values, Ottoman or Islamist, that they think they're restoring, beyond how those values were defined negatively by modernizers of the past. They're chasing ghosts. It may be easy to look at someone like me and construct a narrative about how I am a product of forces operating in the Middle East for the last 2 centuries, call them modernizing or westernizing forces. I'm a secular, well-educated Turkish woman who consumes alcohol and does not wear the veil. What I'm trying to convey to you, however, today is that Erdogan and his fellow reactionaries are also products of the same history. They're not some perfectly preserved denizens from the 18th century, and they have as little in common with an Ottoman subject as do I. If and when a particular order collapses, what emerges from it is not some pure entity that has now shed its burdens and its foreign elements, but rather a transformed something that is fundamentally different than it was before. In Turkey, for example, secular Kemalism is on its last breath, but the strong state that it created has now been put in the service of Erdogan. This is not a restoration of the supposedly glorious past, but a continuation of the problematic present. The same is true for the international system. In the last decade, there has been a lot of hype about rising powers, the rise of the rest, the restoration of balance to the international system, and whatnot. If the modern international order collapses someday, if the power of the West fades, what will emerge is not some true Eastern essence of the so-called rising powers, but hybrid forms that are transformed by the experience of the last 2 centuries. Which I guess raises the question, is there a pure West? To the extent that Western civilization did not have to face the existential question of defining itself as being for or against something that it could not ignore, I think the term West retains its cohesiveness more than the term East. Westernness is not defined by stigmatization to the same extent, even though there are many social hierarchies that operate internally within the West. Yet we have to be cautious about this generalization as well. There are moments when Western identity also slips into triumphalism, projecting all that is negative on outside of the West and becomes self-congratulatory for what it's not. Those are moments when this identity becomes void of substantive values and becomes simply a label for feeling good about oneself by feeling superior to others. We're seeing this play out in a number of contexts these days, most notably in the campaign of Donald Trump in the United States. Those who see the West merely as an identity marker to be proud of commit the same mistake as the reactionary authenticity seekers among Islamists and Muslims who think they can find and restore some pure version of Islam. They missed the larger and far more interesting story about how we have all been transformed by the same historical processes in the last 2 centuries, separated perhaps by their particular manifestation, but not in our degree of exposure. Peace can only be hoped for after We all understand that fact. Thank you.
Well, Professor Zarakol, thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I'm sure there will be many questions from the audience, but first we're going to take a 10-minute break to recharge our glasses, and then we will reconvene for questions and answers that will go on for 35 minutes. Thank you so much.
Its role and its identity problematic. My question refers to the way that the Ottoman heritage is mobilized or talked about in Turkish politics today. I have a certain interest in the history of the Ottoman Empire. Now that's a very long history, 500 years. It's geographically a very wide history, from Maghreb through the Arabic countries and Anatolia, present-day Turkey. Now, in present-day political discourse in Turkey, what precise elements in the Ottoman heritage is referred to? Is it, how does it affect, for instance, the image of the Arabic world? If you stress the Ottoman heritage, how does it affect the emphasis on the Islamic or Islamist heritage? How frequently is the word Ottoman used in, let us say, the speeches, political speeches? Has it a positive or negative color in the textbooks of the schools? I'm not asking for another seminar, but this is quite a central thing. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a great question. Let me answer it by drawing some distinctions with how it used to be when I was growing up, when the Kemalists, the Westernizers, were in power, and how it is now. So, in general, the Ottoman heritage or the legacy of the Ottoman Empire always played a prominent role in Turkish historiography. There was even during the Kemal
We have a microphone dysfunction.
Sorry. I hope people were able to hear me.
Well, and that was the question was asked by Professor Jarle Simensen, a Norwegian historian.
Okay.
I would like to ask a question myself. In your lecture, you referred to Arnold Toynbee, the British historian, and I believe it was in 1951, and I know there are a lot of young people here in the audience. Since World War II, the BBC have had an annual lecture called the Wreath Lecture that you can download as a podcast, so you can hear Professor Toynbee speaking about the West and the rest. I believe that's from 1951 in his own words. And in that lecture, he makes a point that I would like to draw to your attention, and that is that as a defensive strategy, non-Western civilizations have frequently taken parts of Western thinking, internalized it, and made it into a weapon turned against the West. And the example that he uses is communism, an idea that arose in a very particular historical context, industrialization of Germany and Britain, and was internalized in largely agricultural Russia as the essence of this country, and then made into an anti-Western ideology. Do you see the same being the case with Islamism? Thank you.
I think some similar dynamics are at play, but Islamism faces a greater challenge than, well, I suppose communism did too. I mean, the problem is, this problem of backwardness has been defined in such a way that you need a strong, centralized state apparatus in order to deal with the supposed problems of backwardness. So whatever ideology you come up with, really, to address this problem has to somehow identify and justify a strong state. And the particular problem I think Islamism faces is that if you look at the history of state formation in Muslim societies, there are very few periods you could actually look to where there was a strong or a centralized state apparatus. So one of these periods would be, the 14th to 16th centuries, the Ottoman, Mughal, Safavid experiment with some kind of a centralized state. And before that, you have to go almost back to, the original Islamic state, the time of the state of the Prophet, which existed only for like 12 years, and it was an exceptional time. So there are not that many, periods that Islamism can really draw from to justify kind of a state project, but it almost has to, given the conditions that I've identified and other conditions of the modern order. So I think invariably it borrows as without accepting necessarily. So anyway, that's a good question. It's difficult to answer quickly, but I've been doing some work on the concept of the state in Islam that may be helpful in that regard. Yeah.
My name is Christian Rie. I'm a student at the University of Oslo on a bachelor program on religion and society. And I have one question which is maybe unfair to you, and you don't have to answer it if you don't feel like it. But I've just read about a senior fellow called Shami Hamid, who has written a book in 2014, Temptation of Power, Islamists and Liberal Democracy in a New Middle East, 2014. You probably know him. No? Okay. Anyhow, his point of view is that the separation of religion from politics is unlikely ever to happen in Islam. That is the essence in his book, as far as I can understand. While you, if I understand you right, it's a matter of degree and not of kind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, actually, that's also a question that requires a very long answer. And again, I'm not a theologian, but I do. From a historical sociological perspective, actually, that's a very misguided statement. So what I'm referring to now, in response to the previous question, I can elaborate on that a little bit. There were actually long periods where politics and religion were separated in Islam. So, for instance, from about 8th century to 13th century, and I'm talking about the Sunni trajectory right now. There are some differences in the Shiite trajectory. Political rule was seen as something illegitimate and was completely separate from society. So political rulers, the kings and so on, they were there, tasked with external war, but society operated very much separate from politics. And this is difficult to understand because it's a different kind of separation that we're talking about from what happened in Christianity, for instance. But it's a separation nevertheless. So political rulers, for instance, kings, could not really make law. Lawmaking was in the purview of the ulama. Anyway, so this idea that politics and religion have always been fused in Islam is not it's an ahistorical idea. It was when Muhammad was around, but again, as I said, that's a very brief period of, there are a lot of reference to it for various reasons, but it's not really any guidance for any present day situation. And then, in the 13th centuries that Islam has been around, many different experiments have been tried. So it's a mistake, I think, to say it's never been separate. So I disagree with that statement.
Thank you very much. My name is Henrik Sys. I'm a philosopher. Thank you very much for an elegant lecture. Very knowledgeable. I liked the bicycle analogy. And of course, there is something about this when something becomes so tempting to join because there is something about it. There are some values in it that you really would like to be part of. So it's not that you're being forcefully integrated, but you are being invited into it. And of course, here we have Geir Lundestad, who's written excellently on Empire by Invitation. That in many ways is something that characterizes a lot of the allure of the West in post-World War II, that in many ways others wanted to join this and were invited in. But anyway, I would just like to try two brief comments. Firstly, your point about the homogeneity of modernity is true and fascinating. That even if you go to North Korea, there are a lot of things that you will actually recognize, such as the airport building or the roads. Arguably, of course, this is not only something that exists in modernity. The whole phenomenon of empire. I mean, the Roman Empire in many ways represented part of that. And on a spiritual or ideological level, one could, of course, say that Christianity represents something of that. We talked about Toynbee today. Another great historian, Eric Vogelin, has written interestingly on how Christianity radicalized the idea of the individual, regardless of background, being the carrier of God's image. And so I would just point it out, I'm sure you wouldn't disagree, but that these models of homogeneity and universality and the idea of universal humanity is not only a modern construct. Secondly, when it comes to the modern idea of democracy, these Western values, there is, of course, one possible construct of how we get to those that tries to be inclusive. That's John Rawls's concept of the overlapping consensus. Namely, the idea that you sit down and write, for instance, the UN Charter or the UN Declaration of Human Rights, and you try to write it in a way that makes it possible for people from different cultural backgrounds to use their premises and their background to reach the same conclusion. So you don't have to, Jacques Maritain already conceptualized this in 1947 on the UNESCO committee and explicitly said that we have to make sure that we construct human rights that you don't have to argue for only from one standpoint, but where you can be or believe to be a Muslim, and I fully agree with your essentialist critique, but nonetheless where you can have all these different backgrounds and use them as premises for the same. So at least that's an alternative way of thinking about it. And those who actually wrote down the UN Declaration in 1948 explicitly thought in that way, thereby trying to make this not the West against the rest, but an inclusive set of values. Once again, thanks for your lecture.
Yeah. Thank you. So, in terms of homogeneity, I agree with what you've said. I think what's interesting about modernity is that it's supposed to be, the modern order is supposed to be one without a center, so that there could be so much homogeneity in a supposedly decentralized, and mostly decentralized system, I think is remarkable, as opposed to the Roman Empire or, even Christianity having some place you can look to for guidance. As for the second comment, I do welcome efforts to be inclusive, but in some ways the problem is not so much with what the West is doing, but how certain things have become so tainted outside of the West because of where they're originating. So, as in the Putin example, or as in the case of Islamists, but the opposite is also true. I mean, some people like certain things because they're coming from the West without thinking what's the point, right? So the beef eating example. And some people dislike things just because they're coming from the West. And that's what I see as the problem. Instead of evaluating things on their substantive merit, we're looking at their place of origin. I mean, what's the cure for that? I don't know, better history writing and reading. If we can understand the rise of the West as a result of complicated global and regional processes, and at the same time the decline of the Ottoman Empire as part of the same complicated global and regional processes, and instead of thinking about national histories, we understand history as a dynamic system. Perhaps that's one way to get away from just identifying with things with just places, because nothing just belongs to one place, right? Everything is the result of very complicated processes. But of course, that's just, I'd like to believe that's possible, but it may be a little bit of a pipe dream on my part, especially given what's happening around the world.
Right. Bear Brom. Hello?
Okay, yes.
Is this? Yeah, it is. Okay. Hi, Bear Bromler from Ohio State. I very much liked and took your point that a lot of the sort of nativist movements that we see in a lot of these countries are sort of caricatures of their historical antecedents. I think even people in the U.S. who right now want to make America great again have a very distorted view of, wouldn't be able to tell you very much what America really looked like in the time period that they're thinking of. And I also take the point that both Westernization and that sort of nativist counter-reaction are parts of the same process. And what I'd love to know is if you have any thoughts or intuitions about when one is going to happen versus the other. Because your music example made it seem as though you think about this in sort of a complex systems way. Like if we were all to try, if we divided this room in half and gave everybody a list of 20 pieces of music to listen to, probably this half of the room would choose a different song, best song than that half of the room, just because it would be a very idiosyncratic thing. Very idiosyncratic process. So you can't really predict when things are going to happen until they actually do. On the other hand, the cyclist and pedestrian example really sort of suggested more like your work on hierarchy. And it sounded to me if that process played out, there wouldn't be very many pedestrians left because they'd all be sort of muscled off the road by cyclists, right? So I was a little confused as to what you think the process is by which Westernization and sort of anti-Westernization plays out, and I was wondering if you I just wanted to get a better sense of your thought of what that process looks like.
Thank you. That's a really good question, and in the book I try to identify some concrete factors that can help us. Maybe not necessarily predict, but understand why one happens over another. So, and I'm looking particularly at periods of defeat where I think certain decisions are made about, the direction that countries should go to. go towards. And so one thing I identify is, availability of material resources. I think it's more possible to take an anti-Western position if you feel that you can, if you have the luxury of doing so. The other is what I will call, for simplicity's sake, is ideational resources. I mean, whether there is some kind of ideology that you can, as I said in response to this question, that you can justify, anti-Western kind of position. So for instance, if you look at, as in the Russian example, the Bolsheviks versus Putin, Putinism is not quite an ideology at the same level as a competing resource. But the desire is there. And also, I think, coming back to the bicycle club, it matters how open the club is at a given point. So that's why I'm looking at different time periods in history. If you have a chance of joining or not, realistic chance, that also I think affects your decision. But those are some of the things that I'm looking at and trying to identify by this historical comparison. Yeah.
Jeff.
Thank you.
Jeff Taliaferro, Tufts University. I very much enjoyed your lecture, but I have a question regarding some of your earlier remarks about hierarchy and status. No, hierarchy and status incongruity in international politics. I was very taken by your juxtaposition of the examples of Meiji Japan and post-Ottoman Turkey as two societies, as two states, which made very, very conscious efforts to emulate just about everything they could from the West, how they defined it, and how the leaders of both polities were very selective in the parts of the, quote, Western model that they adopted to their particular circumstance. Now, not having, and I will admit, not having read your first book, in the case of Meiji Japan, in the case of later Taisho Japan and Showa Japan, the result was that Japan was blocked or perceived itself by the United States, by Great Britain, from being treated as an equal. Mm-hmm. And they looked around, the leaders looked around and said, well, they have an empire, we want an empire, we deserve to have an empire, China's falling apart, we have a power vacuum here, and this is a threat to our security. And so the Japanese response in the late 20s and the 30s was security through territorial expansion and economic autarky at home. The Turkish experience was something different. Yes, there were conflicts with Greece, but Turkey was incorporated into the West at the dawn of the Cold War and was neutral during the Second World War. I guess my point is, at what point does your model lead us to expect that this type of status incongruity is going to lead to interstate conflict between the state that is trying to emulate and to be accepted by the West and its neighbors and the Western great powers?
Thank you. Well, I mean, let me just clarify what I said. I'm not comparing Meiji Japan with post-World War I Turkey. I'm comparing, because these processes go back, in the cases I'm looking at, well into the 19th century before, I'm comparing Meiji Japan with the Tanzimat period in the Ottoman Empire, which came before that. And in the case of Russia, Peter the Great's reforms even before. But the particular period that I'm looking at, as I said, is after defeat, because usually up until the point of defeat, there are, especially in 19th century onwards, in all of these national contexts, you have groups saying that we should do this, and then you have some groups saying we should do this. So it's a constant debate, like, no, we should we should reject the West, no, we should join it, no, we're actually better in the middle. So I think defeat allows for some, cataclysmic moment where the debate ends, at least for a while, in favor of one or another. And then what determines, as I've said, the outcome, to the extent that one can generalize from such a small number of cases, is again availability of how devastating was the defeat, and what the international system, what were the conditions in the international system at the time. I think in the case of Turkey, I disagree with your characterization that Turkey was accepted in the West. I mean, in a way, yes, it was accepted into various Western alliances, but the goal that was set after World War I, when in the days of the Republic, was completely change everything, and much further than actually the Meiji period in Japan, and then we will be accepted as a European country, as a white European country. So this goal was not achieved, even though there were some degrees of acceptance. If you compare that to Japan after World War II, I mean, what's happening is, by that time, the control of the international system, to some degree, or the club, as you may call, has passed from European powers to the US, and the standards have become more about things like economic development, and so it's become more inclusive in some ways. So I think Japan is more successful in its post-defeat strategy. Again, but there's a ceiling to this strategy. And then when you look at Russia after the Cold War, you see that they toy with this, but quickly decide that they can't, or they don't want to. Anyway, but I mean, I'll stop there, and then we can talk more about the particular dynamics in those cases.
Gail Lindestad, a retired professor of history. I enjoyed your lecture. I think in discussing modernity and transformation, I think we have to distinguish very clearly between the technological side and the more cultural, ideological side. It seems that virtually everybody wants to accept the technological side. I mean, very few countries or movements are against aircraft and cars and cell phones. So this is readily accepted. And my first kind of tentative question is the extent to which it's possible to separate the technological side entirely from the ideological, cultural side when you want to modernize. That's point one. Mm-hmm. Point two is that you have three cases. Of course, the transformation was vastly helped by the fact that all three of these had, in different ways, suffered defeats. Mm-hmm. So it would, in a way, have been more interesting to compare some defeat cases with other cases where they had not suffered defeat, and then study the extent to which they would favor transformation or modernity or whatever we should call it. Point three is, if you then base this transformation on defeat, you could, of course, argue that there is always the danger that since the transformation will be associated with defeat, that they want to do something about it. They want to recover something. Yes. And this is what you see clearly in Turkey, and this is what you see clearly also in Russia. Of course, they accepted all these things in the 90s, and then they discovered that, no, we don't really want to go this far. We want to keep many more things from our past. So the big exception, in a way, is Japan, which did accept change rather completely. I don't think they have changed a word in the Constitution. They kept every word in the Constitution. It was dictated to them by the Americans after World War II, and they kept virtually everything. Now they are discussing Article 9, and you could, of course, then think, well, do we finally see some sort of effort on the part of Japan to to recover something that they lost in this. Okay, these are just my
yes,
very tentative comments. Thank you.
Yes, just let me make a note so I don't forget. Defeat. And okay, so okay, so let me start with the case of Japan. I agree for the most part with what you've said, but it's actually if you look at the case closely, it's not true that it's all dictated by, all the post-defeat choices are dictated by the US. Actually, there are, I think there is a great degree of agency that gets missed, in this. Now we remember the story as just one of occupation and complete American rule, but internally there were debates and also a lot of opposition. So, like the communists, for instance, were a presence in the post-war years. So, and why has it been that, you've seen a reversal in the case of Russia and Turkey now recently, and not in the case of Japan? It goes to these other variables that I've talked about, but I think the tendencies are there. It's just in the Japanese case, people who favor that reversal, for whatever reason, are not strong enough. But it's not that this group doesn't exist. The people who want to reverse that trajectory. So it's not a complete acquiescence in that sense. And then in terms of, yes, the transformation gets associated with defeat. I agree with this. In fact, that was the point I was trying to make. So certain decisions that are made and certain institutions that are introduced, for some people get associated with defeat, and they get associated as foreign impositions or like things that are borrowed. Even though it is possible to imagine a scenario, like let's say, imagine a counterfactual. Let's assume, the Ottoman Empire did not have to deal with the rise of the West. It is plausible to think that some things would have naturally evolved in this direction. And instead, many things, let's say, I don't know, for instance, let's take secularism. It's become, for some people, associated with, Westernization only, and therefore is tainted as a result, which makes it very difficult to debate the substantive value of this thing. So I agree, and that's exactly my point. And as far as comparing it with countries that were not defeated, in some ways, most of the world is defeated, right? They were either colonized, or in which case they didn't really, at least until independence, did not have the luxury of making these choices, or they were defeated in war, but retained some degree of autonomy to make these decisions. So in an ideal world, yes, you're right. It would be great to compare, but I don't know that I have that many other cases. I've tried to broaden the universe a little bit, as I've said, looking at, for instance, Thailand, which is another country. You don't think of Thailand as an heir to a great empire. Well, that's another country that has a myth of not being colonized and so on. There are some similar dynamics there. People have asked me questions about Iran and China, and I think, and Austria, I think some of the same social dynamics and concerns about social hierarchies are in place, but the manner of defeat and the humiliation was different. Anyway, I don't want to lose track of all the questions. And finally, whether you can separate modernization, technological modernization from a particular worldview. I think the early modernizers, and this starts changing a little bit as 20th century progresses, but certainly in the long 19th century and early 20th century, modernizers in the non-West believed that you could not separate. So if you wanted to modernize, you had to take everything. And this is exactly at the root of this problem of things becoming, so others want to reject everything except the technological part. So there is no discussion of, what would have been naturally present anyway. Or some things were wrongly flagged as belonging only to the West and therefore are now rejected. So this idea that you have to take everything wholesale has been a great obstacle in the present day of thinking about what happened in a constructive way. And it's somewhat unique to modernity. I mean, I've been looking at this question, and I've tried to look at historical cases. For some reason, this belief becomes almost universal in 19th and at the end of 19th century that you have to take everything. Whereas historically the pattern is I take this and I only take this. I take the phalanx formation, or I take this superior weapon you have. I don't think that I have to become, I have to convert to your gods in order to. But somehow the modern ontology of 19th century is very hegemonic. It's kind of sweeps over everything. So it seems it seems that you cannot separate parts of it. And why people came to think that, it's a great question that I haven't quite answered yet, that I hope to answer in my future work, and others also struggle with that.